On the grounds of the Catholic University of America in Washington, Ethiopian religious manuscripts are coming to life.
If I told you that Christianity didn't originate in Rome, would you be willing to listen further? While the West tells the story of councils, popes, and empires, in Africa, Ethiopia was a Christian nation from a very early stage. Independent, not under the control of Rome, they wrote the Bible in their own language, preserved the world's oldest manuscripts, and safeguarded books that the West had discarded or lost. Ethiopia even possesses a book containing the secret teachings of Jesus after his resurrection, a text not found in any other tradition. The question is, why have you never heard this story before? In the New Testament, familiar to the West, the period following Jesus' resurrection is described very briefly. The Gospels record only a few appearances, some scattered teachings, and quickly conclude with the ascension. The 40-day period between the resurrection and the ascension is almost entirely left blank. But in Ethiopian tradition, those 40 days are not empty. So, Ethiopian Christianity possesses a text known as the Mashafa Kidan, often translated as the Book of the Covenant. This text does not exist in any surviving Greek, Latin, or Syriac traditions today. It exists only in its entirety in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia. According to Ethiopian tradition, in the 40 days following the resurrection, Jesus Christ not only appeared to prove his resurrection, but also taught continuously. The content of these teachings did not focus on the organization of the church, authority, or laws. The focus was on inner transformation, prayer life, and how people encounter God after the resurrection. A very important point, this text does not describe spectacular miracles, does not tell sensational stories, and does not portray Jesus as a mystical figure detached from life. On the contrary, the post-resurrection sermons are practical and spiritually training. Jesus is presented as a teacher preparing his students for a completely new phase of reality, where death is no longer central, and spiritual life must mature. Mashafa Kidan emphasized that Easter is not just a historical event, but a change in how people perceive the world. Oath's prayer is no longer a ritual, but a state of being. The law is not denied, but it is no longer the central axis of the relationship with God. This was very different from the later development of Western Christianity. When the Roman Catholic Church faced the challenge of governing the empire, doctrinal unity and organizational discipline became priorities. Texts emphasizing profound inner experience, visions, angelology, or cosmic mystery gradually came to be seen as secondary, even difficult to control. Ethiopia is different. The Tewahedo tradition is not under pressure to build a global structure. Therefore, they do not need to cut out texts that focus on direct experience with God. The Mashafa Kidan is retained not because it is a forbidden secret, but because it serves the spiritual life of the community. Another noteworthy point, post-resurrection teachings in the Ethiopian tradition do not deny the cross, but consider it a starting point, not an end. Salvation does not stop at forgiveness, but continues with the restructuring of the human being from within. This is why Ethiopian monasteries use these texts in the training of monks, rather than simply reading them as historical documents. In other words, if the Western New Testament helps readers answer the question, who is Jesus? The post-resurrection Ethiopian tradition focuses on the more difficult question, how should a person resurrected with him live? It is this difference that makes the Ethiopian Bible controversial in the modern world, not because it breaks down Christian faith, but because it places emphasis on something the West has long overlooked, a deep, lasting spiritual life that demands true maturity. The issue isn't whether post-resurrection teachings are right or wrong. The issue is that they lead faith in a direction that is very difficult to control. Ethiopian texts on the post-resurrection period, particularly Mashafa Kidan, offer no new laws, no established hierarchy, and no empowerment of a specific leadership group. Instead, they focus on individuals being trained to live in the reality of the resurrection. This has three major consequences that the West finds difficult to accept. First, authority is no longer externally concentrated, after the resurrection. Jesus emphasized inner prayer, spiritual discernment, and direct experience with God, then religious power no longer rests entirely in the hands of the organizational structure. This does not destroy the church, but weakens the top-down model of control for a Christianity that is becoming a state religion. This is a real risk. Secondly, salvation is no longer a simple legal state. In many Western traditions, salvation is presented explicitly. Believe, be forgiven, be saved. Ethiopian teachings after the resurrection, however, emphasize that the resurrection opens a long process of cognitive transformation where people learn to see the world, time, and themselves in a new order. This is difficult to teach universally and cannot be encapsulated in a formula. Third, spiritual life becomes a skill to be cultivated, not just a belief to be accepted. Mashafa Kidan speaks extensively about prayer posture, listening, and recognizing the divine presence. This is not doctrine to be memorized, but a practice requiring high inner discipline for the majority of believers. The Western Church chooses a more accessible path, clear doctrines, standardized rituals, and transparent leadership. Ethiopia did not face those pressures. They did not need to transform faith into an empire-scale operational system. Therefore, they did not have to sacrifice depth for stability. Post-resurrection texts were preserved because they directly served monastic life, prayer, and spiritual formation. It is important to emphasize, this is not a Western narrative discarding the truth, but rather different priorities creating different memories of Jesus. The West remembers him as the foundation of a unified church. Ethiopia remembers him as the teacher who continues to train people after he has conquered death. Consequently, today, when many find Western faith too structurally complex and lacking in inner depth, Ethiopian texts suddenly become particularly relevant, not because they are new, but because they answer a question the West has long set aside. How does the resurrection change the way we live, rather than just changing our fate after death? In Ethiopian texts concerning the post-resurrection period, Jesus Christ does not focus on proving his resurrection. That is considered clear. The focus shifts to a different question. How should his followers live in this new reality? The teachings revolve around three core points. Firstly, Easter is not just an event, but a change in worldview. According to Ethiopian tradition, Easter ushers in a new order of reality. Time, death, and the relationship between humanity and God no longer operate as before. Faith, therefore, is not only directed towards the afterlife, but demands a different way of living in the present. Secondly, prayer is understood as a state of being, not a ritual. Post-resurrection texts make it clear that prayer is not limited to words or ceremony. It is the cultivation of inner presence, knowing how to listen, to discern, to recognize what comes from God and what is merely human emotion. This is why these texts are frequently used in religious life, where depth is prioritized over quantity. Third, salvation is a transformative process, not a legal moment. The resurrection does not automatically render a person finished. It opens the possibility of transformation. But individuals must enter that process with inner discipline and genuine change. Otherwise, the resurrection is merely information, not life. The key point is this: the post-resurrection teachings in the Ethiopian Bible make faith more demanding, not easier. And for that very reason, they were never suitable to be the foundation of a mass and institutional Christianity. But in today's context, when many feel that faith is too formal and lacks depth, these teachings suddenly become direct and difficult to avoid. If we read the post-resurrection teachings in the Ethiopian Bible seriously, they present a very clear challenge to Christianity today. Faith cannot stop at simply believing correctly, but must lead to real change. In many modern contexts, faith is reduced to a name, a habit, or a set of intellectually accepted beliefs. One may believe in the resurrection of Jesus, but their inner life may not change much. Post-resurrection Ethiopian texts do not allow for such a stopping point. They ask the question directly: if the resurrection is real, why do people still live the same way? If death has been overcome, why do fear, ambition, and selfishness still control behavior? If God were more present, why would prayer life be so impoverished? These questions are uncomfortable. And that's the problem. They force believers to examine themselves. Is their faith a living conviction or merely a familiar system of ideas? Ethiopian teachings suggest that the resurrection is not the end of the salvation story, but the beginning of a more difficult life, a life requiring inner discipline, mindfulness, and personal responsibility. No one can believe on behalf of another in this understanding. That explains why many people today feel these texts strike a chord with the emptiness they carry, not because they are new, but because they speak directly to what modern faith often avoids. True transformation always requires a price. And here's the key point. Ethiopia doesn't offer a more lenient Christianity. They retain a more inwardly rigorous Christianity, where the resurrection doesn't allow people to continue living superficially. The remaining question isn't, do you believe these texts, but rather if your faith hasn't changed the way you live. What does Easter mean to you? So what really lies behind the Ethiopian texts about the resurrection of Jesus? The story of the Ethiopian Bible is not a story of hidden books, a hidden church, or stolen truth. It is a story of different choices in understanding faith. The West chose to build Christianity around clear doctrines, stable structures, and centralized power. Ethiopia chose to retain texts that emphasize deep prayer, inner transformation, and direct experience with God, especially the teachings of Jesus Christ after the resurrection. Neither side is wrong, but clearly, each path holds a different part of the memory of Jesus. In a world where more and more people feel faith is becoming formal, rigid, and detached from real life, these Ethiopian texts compel us to pause and ask, is the resurrection merely something we believe, or is it something that is changing the way we live? Perhaps the most important question is not whether these texts should have been added to the Bible, but rather if Jesus truly rose from the dead. To what extent does our faith today reflect that? What do you think? Please share your perspective in the comments.